It was a frigid, pale dawn somewhere near Remagen, 1945. Ice blanketed the vegetation like cinders, and the noise of footwear grinding across stones resonated down the sodden assembly area. 50 seized German females remained in formation, countenances ashen, mandibles rigid, garments ripped and discolored. Opposite them, a cluster of U.S. medical personnel maneuvered with hushed exactness, documentation boards in grasp, their exhalations misting in the chill. What was approaching wasn't abuse, wasn't questioning. It was more severe in its particular manner. It was the removal of self-respect by regulation. Nobody articulated initially. The atmosphere suspended weighted with degradation and incredulity. One German female, scarcely 20, murmured, "They'll disrobe us like creatures." Another hissed, "Maintain your cranium elevated. Don't permit them observe you fracture." But the Americans weren't sneering or chuckling. Their countenances were impassive, businesslike, detached. That was the impact. Not animosity, not retribution, simply frigid productivity. A squad leader shouted, "Medical examination formation, advance forward." His vocal tone transported no brutality, simply authority. Individually, the females progressed forward, unfastening their coats beneath the dim dawn illumination. Each motion seemed weightier than the previous. The German medic, formerly combatant at the front, recoiled when the American officer's protected appendage halted her. He wasn't leering. He was documenting, calculating, recording contusions, undernourishment, parasites. She comprehended with apprehension that she was being handled like information, not an individual. Documentation suggests that by the conclusion of the conflict, beyond 3,500 German females were seized in the Western theater. Most were medics, administrative workers, or support personnel. They weren't combatants, yet here they remained, subjected to the identical sterile procedure as any POW. The examination possessed one objective: prevent illness outbreaks. But for the detainees, it seemed like a dismantling of their worthiness, fragment by fragment, beneath vigilant American observation. One female subsequently documented in her personal journal, "They observed us like apparatus, no animosity, no desire, simply procedure." That phrase would torment her for decades, because what she observed that dawn wasn't American brutality. It was something more frigid, a mechanical morality. As the final female in the formation progressed forward, an officer elevated a documentation board, tapping his writing instrument against the metallic edge. The noise severed through the ice, harsh atmosphere like a weapon. He adjusted his spectacles, countenance unreadable, and when he glanced upward, what he observed next would determine the inflection of the entire examination. The documentation board descended with a subtle impact against the officer's torso. His countenance remained fixed, detached, systematic. "Commence Section 2, he articulated to the medic beside him. A writing implement scratched against the document. The examination had officially initiated. Vapor elevated from the females' oral cavities as they respired through compressed dentition. Footwear shuffled in the stones. Somewhere behind them, a power source hummed, and the aroma of fuel blended with cleansing powder. The initial female progressed forward. The officer didn't encounter her vision. His protected appendage indicated at the medic. "Examine for parasites. Document contusions. Undernourishment classification 3. His inflection was identical as someone reciting inventory from a provision catalog. The medic's appendages trembled slightly as she annotated everything. The female's skeletal structure displayed through her epidermis, her clavicle acute as cable. She possessed the appearance of deprivation prevalent in the final months of the Reich, sunken facial features, vacant stare. According to U.S. military medical documentation, nearly 40% of German female POWs arriving in 1945 displayed visible indicators of deficiency or ailment. Numerous hadn't observed proper nourishment or cleansing agents in weeks, But statistics couldn't capture the strain in that shelter. The conflict reduced to a catalog of wounds, inflammation, and infections. Each examination was a minor degradation calculated in moments. A German POW murmured beneath her exhalation, "At minimum, the Soviets would have executed us." Another articulated, "No, this is more gradual." Yet when the officer observed her trembling appendages, he didn't shout or discipline. Instead, he paused. His vision flickered to her identification marker, then returned to the documentation. "She's stable," he stated quietly. "Advance her onward." That impartiality severed deeper than brutality. To the seized females, it seemed like being erased. The Americans weren't searching for attractiveness, culpability, or virtue, solely illness. Every contact was methodical, every motion calculated. It wasn't desire or animosity. It was administration with a pulse. Subsequently, one POW would document, "It wasn't brutality. It was degradation by detachment." That phrase would resonate through the quarters for months. As the officer maneuvered down the formation, documentation boards smudged with writing implement marks and digit impressions. His aide wavered. A glimmer of discomfort traversed her countenance. She was youthful, perhaps 21, a U.S. Army medic who'd observed excessive amounts excessively rapidly. And in that instant, she executed a selection that fractured the cadence of the examination entirely. The strained fabric rippled with wind, snapping like a banner over unease. Interior, the examination formation had halted. The youthful American medic, her follicles secured beneath a loose covering, vision rimmed with exhaustion, remained suspended. The subsequent German female waited before her, half-fastened, trembling not from frigidity, but from vulnerability. The officer glanced upward, irritation flickering behind his spectacles. "Persist, Lieutenant," he stated sharply, but she didn't mobilize. Her protected appendages trembled. She'd followed directives from Normandy to the Rhineland, dressing injuries, severing limbs, disinfecting injuries that emanated mortality. But presently, staring at this slender German youth, scarcely senior than herself, the medic's respiration caught. "Sir, this isn't correct," she murmured. The officer's mandible compressed. "We must examine for parasites and ailment. Regulations are regulations." His writing implement scratched again, attempting to erase sentiment with procedure. But something in the medic's inflection fractured the cadence. The formation of POWs stiffened, observing this minor rebellion in quietness. According to Geneva Convention guidelines of 1929, female detainees were to be examined solely by females with worthiness preserved, but field circumstances frequently obscured those boundaries. Documentation subsequently displayed that numerous American medical personnel, overwhelmed by thousands of POWs, followed stripped-down procedures literally and metaphorically. The medic's refusal ignited murmurs among the Germans. One articulated, "She diverted her vision away. That's the initial compassion we've observed." It wasn't sympathy that mobilized them. It was the acknowledgement that someone, even from the adversary, perceived the burden of their disgrace. The officer exhaled. "Acceptable. Advance onward. Visual examination solely." He massaged his cranium, exhaustion weightier than authority. The examination resumed, but more gradually, more quietly. The writing implement marks no extended sounded mechanical. They wavered between phrases. Subsequently, one personal journal notation from a seized German support personnel would state, "She diverted her vision away. That's when I comprehended this was not retribution." For the initial occasion since their seizure, the females observed an American recoil, not from peril, but from moral conscience. Exterior precipitation commenced to patter against the shelter covering, cleansing away digit impressions in the soil. Interior, the quietness intensified, denser than previously. The medic retreated, arranging her appendages, refusing to glance upward again. The officer's countenance solidified. He recognized he couldn't permit that wavering proliferate through his personnel, and thus, within moments, the dispute commenced. The precipitation exterior had expanded heavier, drumming on the shelter covering like artillery distant away. Interior, the atmosphere was dense with perspiration and authority. The examination formation had suspended again, half-dressed POWs waiting, sentinels exchanging uncomfortable glances. The American officer propelled his documentation board onto the field surface. "Lieutenant, we can't accommodate sentimentality," he snapped. "These examinations maintain typhus from the encampments." The medic maintained her position, precipitation liquid trickling from her covering edge. "With consideration, sir, this isn't an examination anymore. It's degradation. They're horrified." A medical officer nearby glanced upward from his annotations. "She's not incorrect," he articulated. The officer's stare severed through him, but the quietness had already transformed. For the initial occasion, the males wavered, not from insubordination, but from uncertainty. According to Red Cross documentation, during the spring of 1945, American medical personnel processed up to 200 detainees per interval during large-scale capitulations. Productivity mattered beyond sentiment. Yet here, Interior 1 shelter in Germany, that cadence had ultimately fractured. The officer paced, footwear grinding in soil. "You believe they didn't degrade our medics in France? You believe they'd waver?" His terminology struck firmly, but lacked persuasion. The medic glanced at the German females, silent, trickling, staring directly ahead, and murmured, "Perhaps that's why we should." The shelter went motionless. For a brief moment, solely the noise of precipitation occupied the location. A youthful enlisted personnel coughed. The officer exhaled through his nasal cavity, appendages descending. "Acceptable," he stated ultimately, vocal tone exhausted. "Minimal contact, visual examination solely, annotate what you can observe, advance the formation." The Germans didn't express satisfaction, didn't express gratitude, but the atmosphere transformed, a peculiar tranquility colored with incredulity. One female documented subsequently, "They engaged among themselves for us." That contemplation unsettled her beyond any contact could have. The revised directives proliferated rapidly, visual examination solely, no unnecessary contact. It rendered the procedure more gradual, but more sanitary, more compassionate, if that terminology even accommodated in conflict. As the shelter illuminations wavered, the medic executed a progression backward, respiring firmly. She recognized she'd prevailed something minor, but authentic. The officer retrieved his documentation board again, his appendage trembling ever so slightly as he rotated to a fresh surface. "Resume," he stated quietly. "Let's conclude this." Exterior, the sentinel shouted, "Fresh directives." The subsequent phase was approaching to commence different directives, identical unease. The precipitation eased by dawn, departing the encampment slick with soil and quietness. The fresh directives had proliferated, visual examinations solely, no contact unless absolutely necessary. It sounded compassionate on documents, but in practice it solely sharpened the periphery of degradation. The females remained again beneath harsh illumination devices, stripped to their undergarments, every imperfection and wound illuminated. The Americans maintained their separation presently. Vision sweeping, writing implements scratching, countenances vacant. The examination formation maneuvered more rapidly. One officer timed them with a wrist timepiece, announcing outward, "Subsequent, subsequent, subsequent." The cadence converted mechanical, almost industrial. But something in those repeated glances seemed more frigid than contact ever executed. The POWs weren't being contacted, but they were being observed in a manner that penetrated deeper. A seized German medic murmured to the female beside her, "They don't even observe us, simply physiques to verify." The contradiction wasn't abandoned on her back home. She'd executed the identical to injured combatants without glancing twice. Presently, she was the subject of the identical detached compassion. According to medical documentation following the procedural transformation, infection instances declined by 18%. Statistically, it functioned. Humanly, it excavated them outward. The American officers marked fevers, contusions, inflammation, all from a separation. A documentation board replaced contact. Compassion became documentation. The identical youthful medic who had refused the strip examination earlier presently remained to the flank, vision lowered, silent. She followed directives, but her posture betrayed exhaustion. Her moral triumph had converted into quiet culpability. Her selection had rendered things more sanitary, but not more compassionate. One German POW would subsequently recall, "They contacted us diminished, but the stare burned deeper." That stare, dispassionate, evaluating, rendered every female perceived dissected without a blade. Behind the formation, one of the sentinels murmured to another, "You ever contemplate if they believe we're creatures?" The opposite raised appendages. "Doesn't matter. Directives are directives." The phrase resonated the identical mechanical reasoning the Germans once utilized. The symmetry was uncomfortable, almost poetic. By midday, the final female traversed examination. The officers authorized off, the illuminations dimmed, and the noise of precipitation returned gentle, forgiving, almost tender. But interior, each pair of vision, something raw had transformed. They weren't simply detainees anymore. They were observers to how compassion could still degrade. As they were directed backward toward the quarters, nobody articulated. The noise of trickling precipitation on metallic coverings followed them into the darkness. Darkness descended firmly and vacant. The females shuffled into their quarters, metallic coverings rattling beneath the wind, a singular illumination device wavering above the entrance. Interior, the atmosphere emanated cleansing agents, damp textile, and terror. Nobody articulated initially. The examination had concluded, but its shadow persisted. They cleansed in quietness, containers clanging, the liquid converting gray with soil and disgrace. A German support personnel, once prideful in her Luftwaffe garment, stared at a reflection in the metallic basin. Her appendages oscillated as she scrubbed, the frigidity biting her digit joints. "They observed everything," she murmured. "Not to anyone, simply to the walls." Opposite from her, another female articulated, "At minimum, they didn't strike us." It was meant as comfort, but it sounded more like capitulation. The quarters were elementary: plywood sleeping platforms, military coverings, cleansing bars stamped U.S. Army. Exterior, sentinels patrolled quietly, the cadence of footwear steady, distant. Interior, the detainees' murmurs converted from degradation to incredulity. They couldn't reconcile what had transpired. The Americans had examined them, disgraced them, but then provided them nourishment. Authentic nourishment. Bread still pliable, preserved legumes, even caffeine beverage. According to U.S. encampment provision documentation, each detainee obtained roughly 2,200 calories per rotation, superior than the average German civilian ration in 1945. Some encampments even allocated vitamins and cleansing provisions from surplus Red Cross inventory. The distinction struck them firmly. The identical appendages that acquired their pride were presently nourishing them beyond than their own command ever possessed. One female documented in her notebook that darkness. "They nourished us superior than our own military executed." It wasn't appreciation, it was bewilderment. Her entire conviction system fractured beneath that contradiction. The younger ones attempted to slumber. The senior ones prayed gently, not for liberation, but for comprehension. Every creak of the sleeping platforms sounded like the resonance of footwear exterior, the shelter earlier that rotation. As the illumination device wavered outward, one female murmured through the obscurity, "Do they despise us or sympathize us?" Nobody responded. The inquiry suspended in the stale atmosphere like an admission. In the corner, the medic from earlier, presently detainee Wand 14B, closed her vision. She wasn't infuriated anymore. She was inquisitive about them, about why the adversary's compassion perceived more severing than brutality. That inquisitiveness would expand by dawn. By sunrise, the quietness had fractured. Vapor from the dawn soup containers blended with discussion that hadn't existed the darkness previously. The German females, medics, typists, support personnel had commenced inquiring interrogatives, minor ones initially. What's interior this bread? Why is their caffeine beverage so potent? How do they acquire cleansing agents that emanate like fruit? It wasn't defiance. It was incredulity converted to inquisitiveness. Exterior the quarters, an American sentinel inclined against a barrier support, tobacco cylinder dangling from his oral cavity. A detainee approached, reluctant but audacious. "Do you exchange?" she inquired, indicating to the tobacco cylinder. He expressed satisfaction and elevated 2 digits. 2 for 1. She provided him a pair of manually constructed follicle fasteners. He transferred her an analgesic packet in return. She stared at the diminutive pale tablets as though grasping treasure. This was how it commenced. Quiet exchanges that exposed something more perilous than rebellion. Comprehension. According to Red Cross documentation, by late 1945, the U.S. Army had distributed beyond 9 million hygiene collections to POW encampments across Europe. Each contained cleansing agents, dental paste, a follicle implement, and sometimes confection. For females who had bathed with frigid liquid and granular material for months, it was civilization in a container. Yet that prosperity didn't comfort them. It insulted them. One detainee articulated, "They engage a conflict and still possess duration for fragrance." Another murmured, "Their garments don't even emanate terror." It was the initial occasion numerous comprehended the conflict had never been equivalent. The Americans possessed not solely more weaponry, but more possessions. Nourishment, medicine, provisions, everything, even benevolence, was rationed from prosperity. A sentinel observed as the German females cleansed their countenances, utilizing American cleansing agents, the aroma of citrus severing through the stale atmosphere. He stated quietly to his companion, "They believe we're celestial beings. Wait till they observe a manufacturing facility." The opposite chuckled, "Yeah, they'll believe we constructed paradise." That darkness, the detainees discussed America as though portraying another celestial body. Transportation vehicles for everyone, dairy in containers, combatants who didn't deprive. One POW documented subsequently, their prosperity was insulting. But that insult would soon evolve into reverence. Once they observed where all that originated from, because exterior, the encampment barrier transportation vehicles were arriving, perpetual rumbling, loaded with provisions that would redefine what authority signified. The ground trembled preceding the noise, arrived. A profound circulating thunder, not from weapons, but from machinery, convoys, dozens of U.S. provision transportation vehicles, grinding through the soil exterior the encampment, arranged nose to rear, ale like a metallic river. The German females, still grasping their soup containers, drifted toward the barrier. The noise consumed the dawn. Fuel vapors occupied the atmosphere. The initial transportation vehicle traversed a GMC CCKW, its flanks stamped with a pale star, fabric flapping in the wind. Then another and another. Timber containers accumulated high nourishment, fuel, medicine, garments, even tobacco cylinders. The convoy appeared perpetual. Some females tallied aloud, reaching 50 preceding abandoning. One articulated beneath her exhalation, "That's beyond than our entire division ever observed." For the initial occasion, they weren't observing at combatants. They were observing at apparatus of prosperity. According to Allied supply chain information, one American infantry division consumed roughly 6,000 gallons of fuel per rotation, beyond than an entire German corps. Each transportation vehicle transported tons of commodities that could maintain a military maneuvering for weeks. Where Germany rationed cleansing agents, the U.S. transported it by the ton. Where the Wehrmacht scraped for spare footwear, the Americans burned antiquated ones simply to fabricate location for fresh shipments. A POW murmured, "No astonishment we forfeited. They possessed beyond transportation vehicles, then we possessed armored vehicles." Her terminology were half reverence, half despair. From the Sentinel Tower, an American squad leader observed them observing. "You can observe it in their vision," he stated to an enlisted personnel beside him. They're comprehending it wasn't about bravery. It was about manufacturing facilities. The convoy maintained arriving field culinary devices, liquid tankers, medical transports. The females couldn't glance away. Some chuckled nervously. Others wept silently. One of them, an administrative worker from Hamburg, pressed her appendages against the barrier and murmured, "We were never engaging combatants. We were engaging production formations." That sight fractured something deeper than pride. It destroyed the illusion of endeavor and equity. The German females had been instructed that sacrifice could prevail a conflict. Presently, they observed that prosperity could conclude it. The machinery faded into the separation, departing solely exhaust and quietness. The encampment suddenly perceived more diminutive, the barriers more authentic. Interior the quarters, one female stared at a container of provisions and stated quietly, "We could never have prevailed." That darkness, the encampment was quiet again, but it wasn't the quietness of terror. This occasion, it was the quietness of comprehension. The females remained on their sleeping platforms, staring into metallic containers of dark caffeine beverage, contemplating not about liberation, but about why they'd accepted what they executed. The transportation vehicles had executed what projectiles never could. They'd displayed the authenticity. A former manipulation administrative worker murmured, "Everything we absorbed was a fabrication." The others didn't respond, but the disgrace in their vision stated adequate. She'd once typed articulations about German superiority, about purity and destiny. Presently, she was wearing a mended American covering, consuming Allied bread, and enduring because of adversary medicine. A U.S. medical officer walked by, providing vitamin tablets through the entrance. One POW glanced upward and articulated, "Danke." He simply acknowledged, maneuvering onward. That brief exchange, wordless and human, severed through years of ideology like solar illumination through combustion. According to post-war examinations by U.S. Army intelligence, beyond 70% of German POWs admitted altering their political perspectives following detention. The statistics weren't manipulation, they were impact statistics, evidence that human contact could dismantle indoctrination more rapidly than questioning ever executed. A female from Dresden admitted quietly, "When I observed their transportation vehicles, I comprehended our conflict was a fantasy. They resided in the future, and we were perishing in the past." Her companion replied, "The Führer stated we were selected, but they possessed transportation vehicles that never halted. Perhaps they were the selected ones." The terminology weren't treason anymore. They were mourning. In her sleeping platform, one of the medics retrieved a ripped notebook she'd maintained concealed since Normandy. She documented, "The fabrications we consumed presently experience like cinders." Then she closed it and concealed it beneath her cushion. Exterior. Illumination devices resonated faintly, illuminating formations of barbed cable that no extended appeared like discipline, simply actuality. The encampment wasn't inferno, it was evidence. From the sentinel location, the youthful American medic from previously observed them quietly. She observed their vision, not defiant presently, but vacant, searching. She contemplated what it perceived like to forfeit not simply a conflict, but a worldview. And then, as she rotated to depart, she observed something unexpected, a minor gesture that would transform everything again. The dawn vapor suspended low above the encampment, curling around the barriers like spectral combustion. The German females arranged for their provisions. Identical metallic platforms, identical quietness. But near the conclusion of the queue, something different transpired. A youthful American sentinel, scarcely 20, observed one of the females lagging behind. Her garment suspended loose on her frame, her epidermis gray with ailment. She coughed weakly and grasped her flank. He glanced around, no officers in sight. From his jacket compartment, he retrieved a minor enclosed bar of cleansing agents, one from the Red Cross container marked medical. Without a terminology, he positioned it on a platform next to the bread. The female, suspended, staring at the pale rectangle like it was precious metal. He simply acknowledged once and maneuvered onward. That was it. No articulation, no motion of sympathy, simply cleansing agents and quietness. Subsequently, that identical female documented, he didn't state a terminology, but it stated everything. To the detainees, it wasn't the cleansing agents that mattered. It was what it represented. A benevolence without demand, a compassion that wasn't political. For months, they'd been handled, calculated, examined, processed. Presently, for one delicate moment, they were observed. Documentation suggests that following hygiene reforms in late 1945, ailment rates in U.S.-operated POW encampments declined by 30%. But what statistics couldn't display was the psychological transformation that followed. The females commenced to cleanse again, not because they were commanded to, but because they desired to perceive human. The aroma of cleansing agents became the aroma of restoration. That darkness, the female who obtained the bar divided it into 3 fragments and shared it with her sleeping platform companions. Each cleansed their appendages in sequence, chuckling gently at the absurd luxury of sanitation. The quarters occupied with the faint aroma of citrus. It was the initial authentic amusement anyone had perceived in weeks. Exterior, the sentinel consumed his final tobacco cylinder and observed the quarter's aperture radiance faintly beneath the lunar sphere. He didn't recognize what his minor gesture had initiated, but by the subsequent dawn, the encampment perceived lighter. Interior discipline commenced to return, but not the variety born of directives. The variety that originates from rebuilding worthiness, 1 bar of cleansing agents at a duration. The noise of sweeping implements became the fresh dawn anthem. The identical females who once trembled beneath illumination devices were presently scrubbing surfaces, organizing provisions, and humming beneath their exhalation. The quarters, once saturated in degradation, had commenced to resonate with something unexpected. Structure, not the variety shouted by squad leaders, but the quiet cadence of population rebuilding themselves. Every dawn at sunrise, the detainees arranged for attendance verification. Then arrived sanitation obligation, laundry, and minor tasks assigned by American officers. It wasn't compelled labor, it was structure. The identical structure that once fractured them presently commenced to elevate them upward. A former administrative worker from Munich commenced instructing English utilizing ripped newspaper fragments. Another, a medic, presented to assist the encampment medical officer disinfect the medical facility. Within a week, the females had constructed a delicate micro-society. The medic documented in her notebook, "We discovered discipline again, but not for conflict." According to U.S. encampment documentation, nearly 40% of German POWs volunteered for internal obligations once their health stabilized. In females' encampments, standards reduced anxiety and ailment drastically. It was psychological triage masked as labor. The youthful American medic, the identical one who'd once glanced away during examination, presently oversaw sanitation schedules. She observed the females maneuver with quiet coordination, and something in her torso softened. They weren't adversary anymore. They were exhausted humans, absorbing to exist again. One dawn, she entered the quarters to discover a minor chorus forming. 5 females singing a hymn in fractured harmony. Their vocal tones were coarse but potent, transporting above the noise of containers and sweeping implement handles. For an instant, even the sentinels paused to listen. The melody wasn't German. It was borrowed from a composition the Americans had been engaging on a field transmission apparatus days earlier. That subtle mimicry was beyond than cultural exchange. It was endurance through adaptation. As solar illumination streamed through fractures in the metallic walls, the encampment no extended appeared like discipline. It appeared like purgatory gradually converting into vitality. That darkness, the medic closed her documentation book and murmured to a medical officer, "They're initiating to recover." He acknowledged, "Yeah, perhaps we all are." But recovering possessed its own perils. Because terminology was proliferating, rumors of liberation, transport catalogs, designations being announced, and with aspiration arrived terror. It initiated as a rumor. A sentinel at the barrier mentioned catalogs. Then a medical officer slipped upward, stating, "Transport." Within a rotation, the entire encampment resonated with murmurs. Liberation. The terminology proliferated like wildfire through the quarters, gentle, trembling, perilous. Some females grasped their rosaries. Others packed what minimal they possessed, a follicle implement, a metallic utensil, an arranged covering. Liberation had once been a fantasy. Presently, it horrified them. One female inquired, "Where will we even traverse?" Her hometown in Königsberg no extended existed. Another articulated, "My parents were in Dresden," and permitted the phrase, "perish." The contemplation of traversing home was no extended a dream. It was an injury reopening. The Americans observed the transformation. Expressions blended with tears. Amusement converted to quiet sobs at darkness. The youthful medic, presently accustomed to standard and countenances, walked through the quarters, tallying craniums. "You'll be traversing home soon," she stated gently. A vocal tone from a sleeping platform responded, "To what home?" According to U.S. Army repatriation documentation, beyond 425,000 German POWs were dispatched home from American encampments by the conclusion of 1946. The procedure was massive transportation vehicles, vessels, documentation, medical examinations. But for numerous of these females, the concept of home had eroded. The conflict had burned maps and memories alike. In one corner, a female polished her footwear with the corner of a covering, her appendages steady for the initial occasion in months. "If they observe us sanitary," she murmured, "perhaps they'll forget what we were." Another assisted braid her follicles. Opposite the chamber, someone hummed the identical hymn from previously, but more gradually, more delicate. The medic observed them with blended perceptions. Fragment of her was relieved. It signified fewer patients, fewer nightmares, but another fragment ached. She had arrived to recognize their narratives, their countenances, their minor jests during provision formation. Presently, she'd observed them vanish, one transport at a duration. As darkness descended, machinery rumbled faintly beyond the barrier. Transportation vehicles were being prepared. The sentinels articulated quietly. Vocal tones waited. The females didn't slumber. They reclined awake, grasping their minor possessions, staring at the covering. Liberation was arriving, but nobody recognized if it was rescue or exile. Sunrise arrived gradual, ashen, and silent. The transportation vehicles waited in neat formations, exterior the portal. Fabric tops, slick with moisture, machinery humming like a steady pulse. The German females progressed outward individually, each transporting a minor container, their countenances unreadable. The sentinels didn't shout directives anymore. They articulated quietly, almost respectfully. Individually, designations were verified off the documentation board that had initiated it all. The youthful American medic remained near the portal, grasping her covering against the wind. She observed the females ascend aboard, their footwear slipping in the soil. For weeks, she'd observed them as patients, inmates, survivors. Presently, they were simply travelers, returning to a nation she couldn't imagine ever perceiving like home. Each transportation vehicle transported approximately 80 detainees. Timber benches arranged the interior, metallic barriers rattling as the machinery accelerated. The atmosphere emanated fuel and damp textile. Several females attempted to express satisfaction, gesturing faintly toward the encampment sentinels. Others stared directly ahead, vision vacant but tranquil. According to military transport documentation, each convoy transported roughly 400 POWs per journey toward the northern harbors, mostly Bremen and Bremerhaven. There, vessels waited to transport them backward into a fractured Germany. The journey could require rotations, sometimes weeks. Interior one transportation vehicle, a female grasped her container firmly, murmuring a phrase she'd repeated since seizure. We departed sanitary, nourished, and bewildered. The others acknowledged in quietness. As the convoy circulated outward, soil elevated behind the tires, obscuring the peripheries of the encampment. The females didn't glance backward. They didn't require to. Their memories were carved, profound, adequate. The medic elevated her appendage in a minor salute, a motion of consideration rather than farewell. One detainee captured her vision through the rear flap of the transportation vehicle and provided a faint acknowledgement. Two strangers bound by a conflict neither desired. The medic lowered her appendage, perceiving against the dawn glare. The transportation vehicles rumbled down the soil route, the horizon expanding with gray atmospheric formations. Interior, the detainees remained appendage to appendage. No compositions, no articulations, simply the low resonance of machinery and contemplations excessively weighted to articulate aloud. Somewhere in the separation, religious structure, bells resonated above the ruins. Home was near, but tranquility still perceived impossibly distant. Years subsequently, in a quiet cafe in Hamburg, one of those females remained opposite from a journalist. The conflict was chronology presently, but its shadows still adhered to her vocal tone. She was 60, her follicles metallic, her posture straight. When the journalist inquired what instant remained with her most, not a confrontation, not the capitulation, but that examination. She glanced downward at her appendages preceding responding. They examined our physiques, she stated gently, and it perceived like the conclusion of worthiness. She paused, tracing the edge of her beverage container. But subsequently, I comprehended it was the initiation of something else. The journalist inclined forward. What do you signify? She expressed satisfaction faintly. We believed they meant to degrade us, but they were simply executing their obligation. And in that frigid obligation, there was no animosity. That's what revolted us most, that they didn't consider adequate to despise. Her terminology suspended between them like combustion. Following the conflict, documentation displayed that solely approximately 3% of female POWs ever filed formal complaints about their handling by U.S. forces. Most portrayed their impact not as physical harm, but as moral disorientation. They had anticipated brutality and discovered administration instead. For numerous, that detachment was more firm to process than suffering. The female acquired a gradual consumption of caffeine beverage, her vision distant. They stripped our pride, not our epidermis, she stated, and when I glanced backward, I comprehended that's what fractured us. Not appendages, not combustion, procedure. Exterior, traffic hummed, detached as ever. The metropolis had rebuilt itself from debris, transparent material towers above antiquated foundations. But for her, the memory of those illumination devices, those documentation boards, those quiet American medical personnel, had never faded. I despised them for how tender they were, she murmured ultimately, because it rendered me observe who we had become. The journalist stated nothing. His recording apparatus clicked off with a gentle snap. She glanced outward the aperture, precipitation commencing to descend, steady and gray, simply like that dawn in 1945. Perhaps, she stated almost to herself, humanity endures solely when procedure perceives like compassion. And as the precipitation droplets obscured the metropolis illuminations, the reflection of a pale fabric shelter appeared to waver in the transparent material, distant, spectral, forever captured between disgrace and endurance.